So, in terms of developing that shared vision or the community aspiration, as we call it, that was probably the real start of doing things differently, getting everybody on the one page with the actual need to speak to community. So there were 1,600 community conversations that happened over a 9-month period, and then those community conversations were distilled down to particular themes for what the community wanted. And I always think it's really interesting that often we either don't ask community because we're afraid of what they might say, or we're afraid we might not be able to act on what they might say. If we do ask, we don't listen. And if we listen, we often distill it down to something that the community hasn't said because it fits in with our funding guidelines. And I think for us in this community, it was the first time we asked, we listened, and then we acted on what the community actually said to us. So I think it's been a really pivotal change for us in this community, and an important change.
So the conversation period went for 8 months, but for 3 months of that time was our testing phase. So we wanted to make sure that the questions that we took out and the process that we took out to community was going to meet the needs of our community. So we developed a set of questions. I remember we developed a long questionnaire and we developed a short questionnaire, and we took that out and realised very quickly the long one was far too long. We needed to be more direct, really cut it down. So it ended up being only 5 questions. They were really broad, but they covered off what people loved about their community, but also where we could be working. So there was lots of testing. We went out to, I remember going to working with the maternal child health nurses at council, and we asked them if they could go out and have conversations with their clients. And at that point we realised we'd got it right, because the maternal child health nurse was sitting on the ground talking with her client as the baby's playing, and they could have a conversation. It was able to be recorded and it worked really well. So I can't really stress enough how important that testing phase is, and that's on everything we do. So we will always ensure that we go out and test anything we do. We need to be vulnerable. We need to know that we can create a piece of work. We might think this is it, but then realise, no, this is not it. We need to change, we need to refine, and that's fine. That's how it should be. Our approach was that we wanted to we wanted to go to people. We didn't want people to come to us, but we wanted to work through people who already had relationships with people in our community. We were tracking the engagement plan over this 8-month period, but about halfway through we realised that we weren't hearing enough from men in our community. We weren't hearing enough from our Aboriginal community members or people from cultural backgrounds. So this then became a real focus of our work. One of the challenges was when we were approaching organisations to then for them to have conversations, they were very open and very positive about having conversations, but it seemed that they lacked the resources and time to be able to follow through and have the conversations. With their day-to-day work, it just seemed that it was too difficult. So we were really fortunate that we have a relationship with our local TAFE here, and we were able to have 14 community services TAFE students come and do placement with us. So they were placed in different organisations within the community, but their work was to have conversations with our community. So the Hands Up Mallee backbone, we did a lot of work in working with the TAFE students and getting across what we were wanting to achieve through the conversations. But that is when those 14 TAFE students come on board, that's when our conversations really started to go up, because they could go out and reach so many more than what we could just as backbone staff. So that was a really positive community relationship for us and for them.
Community Leaders Table is a group of really committed local people who want to be involved in creating that positive change in our community. They support the work of Hands Up Mallee, they drive the work of Hands Up Mallee, and they are representative of our community.
So how I became involved in Hands Up Mallee, my daughter was doing work experience with them, and she told me that they'd been out doing interviews with community to try and gauge what the feeling was about the statistics for our region. and she invited me along to one of their meetings to see if I'd like to become a member of the Community Leaders Table, which was very exciting and something that I really was happy to do in the end. At first I was nervous. I didn't really know if I had anything to contribute. But after seeing the statistics and realising how bad our community was doing, I didn't really feel that I had an option. I had to get involved and wanted to see some change take place in our community. So the introduction to the Community Leaders Table was quite interesting. I'd never attended any of those sorts of meetings before. I'd never been involved in a community project. So I wasn't really sure what to expect, and when we got there it was quite informal, and it was interesting to find that there were people there from business, services as well as community. So that made me feel a little bit more at ease because I realised that I wasn't the only one there. And it was all informal. It was always a collaborative situation right from the get-go. So we discussed different issues that were happening in our community. We would break into little groups and do some work on that, come back, discuss what we felt about things, and that's just how it started right from the word get-go. It was all about collaborating and getting in together and seeing if we could nut out what a solution might look like. Trying to come up with a common agenda was quite an interesting process, and it's not as straightforward as you would think, because there's so many statistics to take into account. It was a lot of thrashing out ideas. A lot of people had different visions of how they thought things would pan out. So the meetings that we had, for myself even, I thought that perhaps we would be targeting teenage years. And I know that a lot of people probably had a different age group or part of the community that they wanted to focus on. So bringing that together was really unusual, and it did take a lot of time. It took 12 months of coming together and discussing those issues and trying to work out where we could put in the best disruptor before we even got to our common agenda day. And then that was a room full of people from vast walks of life.
So the Community Leaders Table is about just community members from all over the community coming together once a month, sharing, connecting, and just giving each other different perspectives. I think it matters to me, being Aboriginal, that my people have a voice. So that really matters to me, that I can advocate for my people. It hits home. Like, I love Mildura, love the community, so it's special.
So after the common agenda was set, it became a little more formal. So we actually had to put in an interest of why we would like to be on the Community Leaders Table, and they were going to make it quite formal. There'd be so many from service, business and community. And that sounded sensible at the time, but I think it was very quickly realised that that's not actually how it works. It's a very organic beast, and people will come in at the time when they're needed, but they may flow out when their part's done and someone else will pick up the baton. So I think that's really structured vision didn't last very long because it didn't work. I think people did feel disengaged or alienated, perhaps. So I'm glad to see that it's back to its organic self and people come to the meetings when they can make it. They're networking, we all talk to each other, we network with the community, and I think we've found some really rock solid people who are always there. They will always be at meetings and they will always contribute. Yeah, so that was an interesting part.
I think the adaptability with this sort of work is absolutely key. One of the changes we've had to make, and we've had to make it a lot over the last 12 months, is thinking that we are going to work on one particular aspect and the community voice really telling us we needed to work on something else. So our initiative spans from 0 to 25. We were thinking at the start of last year, let's start with children that are 0 to 2. We'll work in that area. We'll get some things going. We'll move forward from there. What kept popping up was youth. We kept having ideas from youth. We had the community telling us we needed to work with youth. And we got to the point where we just needed to stop and we needed to listen to what community was telling us and take up on the opportunities that were presenting themselves at that time. And I think that that's a really important part of this work. There's a flow to it that you cannot predict, and you need to be able to adapt, and you need to be able to work on the things that are coming up at that particular time in line with your community aspiration. I think that's really important. So we had a youth leadership table that we merged with our community leaders table, and we'd actually merged those two tables because we had a youth role in the backbone that was actually coming to an end. And we were thinking we would leave the youth work until a little bit later. This youth role was going, we'd focus on the early years. And funnily enough, as that youth role was winding back, was when the voice of youth in community really showed itself quite strongly. So probably predominantly through the community leaders table. And ironically, I think for us, merging the youth leadership table with the community leadership table was also a really good move. Rather than it silencing youth, I think it gave youth more of a voice. And I think often we divide off youth from adult leadership, but youth are our future, and they have ideas that need to be listened to, and often adults need to support those ideas to bring them to fruition. And I think that's really what we found with the community leadership table. Having the youth leadership table just in the mix with the community leadership table was such a positive thing because there were so many spin-offs from both sides. So I think it's about having those mechanisms to be able to hear community, and I think it's spending time listening. And I think it's also really about making that time to listen and seeing that as a really important part of your role. It's very easy to get caught up in the paperwork, in the endless emails that aren't done, where really the work is listening to community and making the space and the time to be out in community. And I think that work happens. It's not a 9 to 5 job. And I think that is part of being in a small community. You cannot do this work in a small community and work 9 to 5. You hear things all the time, you're responding to things all the time, and you need to be open to that. That's how you really hear community.
I think the fact that people need to understand the process that you need to go through, and that it is more about a process than actual something that's going to miraculously appear, and for sustainable change and the hard work you have to just keep being persistent and hold the process up as the thing you need to perpetuate, like the framework or the way that you need to collaborate and cooperate. That needs to become the model that we're continually reinforcing, and having that mutually reinforcing approach all the time is what will change community and change the outcomes that we're all trying to seek. But you need to not do it in isolation to the whole. Sometimes we put a lot of effort on a particular project and lose sight of, well, are we measuring it? Is it making a change? What's the data telling us? How do we then weave that back into the evaluation and then say, well, what worked before, now we need to change it up because that's not what's not going to work now. So we just don't keep continually putting out there what worked previously, because that's probably not going to sustain it. And the biggest thing is that's changing is everything is changing. The environment's changing, the funding environment's changing. You know, there's aged care reforms, there's a whole lot of things that are going to impact on the community. Unless we have that ability to adapt and change and have all the players on side, including government, community, agencies, the sectors, then it's really hard to respond and be agile to respond to the challenges that we face. So that's why getting this embedded in the way that we do work is really important, from the governance level right down to the generation of projects that we know are going to respond in a positive way to the community.